What's up? What's up? So I realized that Thomas Sowell has an interview that's about like Trump's tariffs and various things. I thought I'd react to it. Whether I can be asked to say anything is another matter. You know, I might just steal the content. Where are we at? Where are we at? Alright. You see?
His newest.
Why is it already 1 minute in? I haven't even watched it. That's weird. You know, I was just reading Intellectuals and Society, his 1984 book. Right, let's just warm up because I had to like share it. I shared it on Blue Sky, which is the right place to share this kind of thing. But so he writes about media coverage, right? He's got this whole thing about media coverage. My man's got this whole thing about media coverage. And he claims that the media coverage of homelessness in the 80s wasn't brutal enough. Homelessness, so here it is. Here's the excerpt from Intellectuals and Society, written in 1984, I think, something like that. Homelessness is another area where much of the media filters what kind of reality gets through to their audience. During his time at CBS News, Bernard Goldberg noticed the difference between what he saw on the street and what was being broadcast on television. In the 1980s, I started noticing that the homeless people we showed on the news didn't look very much like the homeless people I was tripping over on the sidewalk. The ones on the sidewalk, by and large, were winos or drug addicts or schizophrenics. They mumbled crazy things or gave you the evil eye when they put paper coffee cups in your face and asked for money. Note the inverted commas. But the ones we like to show on television were different. They looked as if they came from your neighborhood and mine. They looked like us. And the message from TV news was that they didn't just look like us, they were like us. On NBC, Tom Brokaw said that the homeless are people you know. Now here comes Sowell. If the homeless tend to be sanitized in the television news, businessmen tend to be demonized in movies and television dramas, as another study found. So, like, I don't think it's occurred to either Thomas Sowell or Bernard Goldberg that most homeless people aren't in fact winos or drug addicts or schizophrenics, and in fact they are kind of people like you, because a lot of people are at risk of homelessness and have drifted in and out of it, and they're not all screaming expletives at you while simultaneously injecting heroin and also exposing themselves. What the fuck? Like this is mad, right? And then this is all he says. His conceit is just that you should be representing homeless people in the worst way possible. And obviously most homeless people aren't like that. Also, there's questions over, you know, how you treat people who do have those kinds of problems, obviously. But one of the other things that it seems didn't occur to me in this section, didn't occur to Sowell, was what if the reason that representations are tend to be more positive, right, is because the existing representations and stereotypes about homeless people and other groups are themselves too negative. Like, what if it's a correction? That doesn't seem to occur to him at all throughout this section. So remember, this is the 80s. I'll read this out, then we'll get to the actual interview. So he is going off on the gays, because of course. Despite an abundance of statistical data being published on virtually every conceivable comparison among groups, no data on the average lifespan of homosexuals compared to the national average, the cost of AIDS to the taxpayers compared to the cost of other diseases, much less a comparison of the incidence of child molestation among heterosexual and homosexual men, is likely to find its way through the filters of the intelligentsia to reach the public. Even though there is a well-known national organisation openly promoting homosexual relations between men and boys. Which one? What's he talking about? Okay, hands up, I don't have the context here, but like, it would be good if he referenced it. Conceivably, data on such matters might later rest some concerns about homosexuality expressed in some quarters. Yes, of course it would. That's what they were looking for, the homophobes in the 80s. They just needed the data. But few among the intelligentsia seem prepared to risk what the data might show if not filtered out. Might it show that the gays are rampantly giving our children AIDS? Is that the suspicion here? Is that what was happening in the 80s, Tom? In this, as in many other cases, it is too much for some to gamble the fate of a vision on the roll of the dice, which is what empirical verification amounts to for those dedicated to a vision. It's like, bro, if you care this much about that much about this data, right? If you care about the data, why don't you go and fucking gather it instead of complaining about intellectuals? But that would require him to talk to gay people, which of course he wasn't prepared to do. This is especially true for reporters who are themselves homosexual. They've got gay. They can't talk about being gay because they've caught it. Their minds are infested. And I can't even finish this, man. It's so funny because when you go back in time, right? Again, what's this? Fucking 40 years ago, Sowell wrote this. It's just ridiculous. He has absolutely no idea about homosexuality or homelessness or anything. He doesn't really bother to look into it. He just thinks that the prejudices that he holds and that are repeated a lot in the media are correct, and any attempt to kind of right those by doing something different is necessarily an imposition of the intelligentsia. God, what a cunt. What a cunt. Anyway, do you all want to listen to him for an hour? Shelter Blues, a wonderful book about homelessness. That sounds interesting. There was one that was recommended to me called, I think it's just called something like Poverty in America, which obviously isn't narrowly about homelessness, but probably similar themes. I've spoken to a couple of homeless people on this channel recently, or people who have experienced homelessness in the past. Neither of them are actually homeless now. There's a couple more in the wings, but as you can imagine, it's difficult to book any guest for a podcast or something, but like with obviously that type of guest, their lives are a bit more unstable. So I'll speak to them when I speak to them. This must be a stab at the church, as if. I would love it if it was a stab at the church, that men and boys. It's not, it can't be. The gay mind virus preceded the woke mind virus. Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. It's always something, isn't it? It's always bloody something. All right, fine. Let me know about...
One guest on this program one is more requested by far than any other. Thomas Sowell on Uncommon Knowledge now.
I do want to say that going into this interview, having seen an excerpt of it, I think he is largely against Trump's tariffs for all the right reasons, which is one thing that made me want to listen to him, because I thought, well, okay, you know, let's give credit where it's due.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Thomas Sowell lived in Gastonia, North Carolina to the age of 9 when his family moved to Harlem. After attending New York City public schools, Thomas Sowell worked in machine shops, tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers, moved to Washington, D.C. to join the civil service.
Is this really new? Yeah, it was uploaded 40 minutes ago. Oh, you can't even see. Good Lord. It's uploaded 40 minutes ago. Hey? Hey? I think I have to be here, though.
Became a United States Marine and finally settled into a track in higher education that would take him from Howard University to Harvard University, where he received his undergraduate degree, to Columbia, where he earned his master's, and then to the University of Chicago, where he earned his doctorate in economics. After teaching at institutions including Douglas, Cornell, and UCLA, Dr. Sowell joined the Hoover Institution here at Stanford, where he has remained a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution for more than 4 decades. Dr. Sowell is the author of thousands, literally, I checked this, thousands of newspaper and magazine columns and of some 6 books. His newest project is a website, Facts Against Rhetoric, which you can find at factsagainstrhetoric.org. We're announcing this website today in this podcast for the very first time, so let me repeat it. Factsagainstrhetoric.
Oh, is that a bit of rhetoric? Let me repeat it. Facts Against Rhetoric. Is that a little bit of rhetoric there, mate? Jesus Christ, who do these people think they are? Facts Against Rhetoric. Like, I don't know how fucking blind you have to be to think that, like, you and you alone have the facts on your side and everyone else is just using rhetoric. Obviously, communication is a combination of those two and other things, but whatever.
.org. Tom, welcome back.
Yeah, also the website looks
Tom,
very
your website, I've spent hours with it now. It represents...
Spent hours with it. Who wouldn't on a website that looks like it's from the actual birth of the internet?
It's a kind of syllabus or curriculum for the right way, the correct way to think about modern life, with topics ranging from culture to economic issues to education to war and peace. Why did you go to the trouble of pulling these materials together? Wouldn't students come across this material in ordinary college courses in any event?
Oh, we're going to have a great afternoon, everyone. This guy's questions are so loaded. I cannot believe it. Honestly, it's so funny how loaded his questions are.
No, I thought of it as enabling students to get an education despite being in college.
All right. All my questions today are drawn from the website, or use the website as a point of departure. Economic issues. Under the heading on the website of economic issues, you provide a link to your classic work, Basic Economics. A brief passage from that book. I'm quoting Basic Economics. Empirical questions are questions that must be asked if we are truly interested in the well-being of others. Perhaps the most important distinction is between what sounds good and what works. On the one hand, what sounds good. On the other, what works. Why is that distinction so important?
I guess it was because rhetoric and visions play such a large part in higher education. The question of whether some vision is correct, what they believe is correct, I saw recently a replay of something by AOC, the Congresswoman
Yes.
from New York. And as I listened to her, I just was amazed that there seemed to be no factual issue as far as she's concerned. She just pronounces things to be so, and that's the end of it. And unfortunately, I think too many certainly, college students and students in high school for that matter, are introduced to a certain vision of the world where, for example, the capitalists are exploiting the workers and so on. And they just memorize that, and they talk about it as if it's a known fact. And there's no developing in those students the ability to look at two different views and try to figure out which of them is correct. To me, back when I was teaching, if
you're so interested in facts, why don't you play something that AOC actually said and demonstrate that it doesn't have any facts in it? That's ridiculous. Does he know anything about AOC? She's got a degree in economics, right? She's got a degree in economics. She won't have been taught Marx. You're not taught Marxist economics, that workers are exploited. That's just ridiculous. It's actually self-parody for him to say that he's launched a website called Facts Against Rhetoric and then accuse everybody else of not using facts without reference to a single specific thing that she said. That is absurd.
taught a course that had a lot of controversial stuff in it. I would spend a great deal of time putting together a reading list where I would find the strongest argument on one side of a particular argument, and then the opposing view, the best example I could find of that, and I would then present that to the students. And when I tested them, I didn't test them on which side you believed. I tested them on whether they understood the arguments on both sides. I suspect, from what I see and hear, that that is something that's rarely done today in education at the college or high school level.
I see.
I suspect that this isn't done. That you just described like most fucking university courses. What's he talking about? The only place this isn't done, by the way, is like economics degrees. Because economics degrees are largely solving maths by rote. So you don't really get critical argumentation. But you do in like politics, philosophy, the humanities, critical theory, even in like, an English language or English literature degree, like any degree that isn't like a science degree. You'll probably get it to an extent in a science degree as well. I just don't. What's he talking about?
So, the old-fashioned principle of teaching, which is that before you make up your mind where you stand, you make sure you understand where the other person stands first.
Yes.
All right. Tom, again on your website, factsagainstrhetoric.org, you provide a reading list, but you also provide links to a number of videos and podcasts. Here's one. This is a link to your old professor at the University of Chicago, and then for many years your colleague here at the Hoover Institution, Milton Friedman. In this video, to which you link on your website, Milton is addressing the question, is capitalism humane? Take a look at this, if you would, with me, Tom.
It's true that if you had a concentrated power in the hands of an angel, he might be able to do a lot of good, as he viewed it. But one man's good is another man's bad. And the great virtue of a market capitalist society is that by preventing a concentration of power, it prevents people from doing the kind of harm which really concentrated power can do. So that I conclude that capitalism per se is not humane or inhumane. Socialism per se is not humane or inhumane. But capitalism tends to give free rein, much freer rein, to the more humane values of human beings. It tends to develop a climate which is more favorable to the development, on the one hand, of a higher moral atmosphere of responsibility, and on the other, to greater achievements in every realm of human understanding. Thank you.
All right.
Good thing billionaires haven't bought up all the media. Haha, good thing a Czech billionaire isn't looking to buy up the post office in the UK. Good thing a Canadian billionaire isn't trying to buy up the New Zealand media. Oh, and there's that other stuff that's happening in the US as well, but let's ignore that.
That's Milton. Now, it's one matter to argue that capitalism represents the least bad system, but it's another to argue, as Milton did just then, that capitalism produces, quote, I'm quoting Milton in that clip, a higher moral atmosphere, close quote, and again, quote, greater achievements in every realm, close quote. Tom, wasn't your old professor and your Hoover colleague Milton Friedman getting a little carried away there?
I don't think so. But
This is like The Simpsons. This is literally like when they interview Sideshow Bob for the mayor's position in The Simpsons. This is like just absolutely like premeditated tee up questions. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. I can't get over it.
if he was, it was the way to answer would be to put forth opposite evidence to what he's saying, and that's what doesn't happen. That is, a lot of what is called education is really indoctrination, and so it's not a question of whether I happen to agree with Milton Friedman or anyone else who's watching. It's a question of do the people who would disagree with him have any facts, any reasoning, any logic?
Obviously, yes.
That would be relevant to what he's saying, and
Tom,
all too often.
So, Sowell doesn't really seem to be answering any of these substantive questions directly. He just keeps saying that there's a problem with education. And I don't know, like I mean this in the nicest way possible. He's pretty old. So like maybe that's why he's just not quite as sharp as he was, right? Because he was quite sharp when he was younger. But obviously, right, universities, right, are not a product of capitalism. A lot of the time, they have some kind of government funding. Many of them predate capitalism. Oxbridge predates capitalism. They're institutions which are built on entirely different principles than market principles. And it's you know, your mileage may vary in the modern day, right? But just to say a sweeping statement like capitalism leads to what did Friedman say? Like the highest ideas, the most achievement and ideas. A simple counterexample, but I suppose for them, universities, everything's gone wrong at universities, and I guess the real insights lie at libertarian think tanks funded by billionaires. I don't know.
It's not true. They don't.
Could I ask you, the website again is factsagainstrhetoric.org, and you've already told us that
Stop displaying that.
The reason you pulled that together was to produce evidence, to be empirical, to teach students to be empirical, to look at the facts. On the other hand, from this passage I just quoted, from Basic Economics, your book, empirical questions are the questions that must be asked if we are truly interested in the well-being of others. And then Milton just said in that clip that capitalism produces a higher moral atmosphere. I just want to tease this out, that as best I can tell, your insistence on empiricism, on looking at the facts, is
Whoa! Who said The Simpsons is garbage in chat? You make me sick. You make me very sick.
Because you have a sort of moral groundwork on which you insist. There's a pre-existing sense of morality, of right and wrong, and of our duties to each other. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
All right.
Without that, civilization would just not be possible. I mean, every one of us is vulnerable to all sorts of things. If we couldn't rely on someone, take it from birth. I mean, we come into the world knowing nothing. We don't even know that we need food, much less how to get any. And so you must have a structure.
Well, I don't want to nitpick, but surely, like, if you're breastfeeding when you're a kid, like, you instinctively breastfeed, you know that you need food. I mean, you don't know what it is, right? You can't articulate the thought, but you do. Animals know that they need food. What's he talking about? Also, what does this have to do with capitalism? Is he sort of doing a very basic sort of human nature, moral philosophy thing? I don't see where this is going.
It's also true that even as we move toward adulthood and into adulthood and old age, there are times when other people, and lots of them, are essential to our own well-being. I think of all this talk about equality. In a sense, equality is enormously important, and in another sense, it's enormously irrelevant. It's important that we have equality before the law. It's important that we regard each other with a certain kind of equality. But to talk in terms of equality of capabilities is madness. I mean, if you're the world's leading authority on some particular subject, that doesn't mean that you have even minimal competence in 100 other things. And it's one of the most dangerous things in the academic world and among intellectuals in general is they often seem to assume that they know better than other people about all sorts of things, including things that these other people know from their own personal experience. And that's what makes intellectuals so dangerous.
All right. So he is touching on something which is a genuine puzzle, which, by the way, you will encounter in like any introductory political philosophy course we did, which is that equality can be kind of difficult to define, right? Like when we say that people are equal, what exactly do we mean by that? We probably don't mean that everyone is exactly the same, right? We don't necessarily even mean that everyone has exactly the same income. We don't want to like equalize height. All of these kind of absurd examples, you'll discuss them in an intro political philosophy course. But what he does is sort of raises that objection, half raises it, and then just rants about intellectuals, despite the fact that intellectuals do address that, right? So that's stupid. Also, one other thing about Sowell that I find is that he'll substitute this people having the same capabilities is absurd. He'll say that. And okay, yeah, that's fine. Like, I can't play football like Lionel Messi. Fine, whatever. But he'll have that discussion and he'll do things like contrast cities and rural areas and say they'll always be different. He does this in Wealth, Poverty and Politics, his book, a lot. And that's like, okay, that says maybe rural areas will always be different to cities. Sure, fine. That really has no practical relevance for the question of like whether you would start some kind of regeneration program in a rural area or in a city. The fact that Lionel Messi is much better at football than me, 1,000 times better, I don't know, 1,000,000 times better. Does that justify his salary relative to mine, which is obviously absurd? Isn't it like £1 million? Isn't it £1 million a week at PSG? It was £1 million a week at PSG. Something like that. It was something ridiculous, right? No. So there are all these different contours, and some of them are like about how the economy is structured and about the law and about society and politics, right? And others are kind of things that we can't change. Yeah, you know, like some people are taller than others, you know, but taller people earn more money. Should taller people earn more money? Maybe not. Maybe that's something you question. But he just evades those substantive debates, which apparently intellectuals aren't aware of. Sowell again, why spend time critiquing him after a total of 5 hours of videos? Mate, how am I quiet? My mic's turned right up, you know. Wait 1 second. Okay.
Back to your website, Tom. Under the heading Biographies, you provide a link to A Personal Odyssey, which is your own autobiography or memoir. Here you are in A Personal Odyssey describing your response to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I'm quoting you. The idea seemed to be that white people's sins were all that stood between us and economic and social parity through American society. the enormous amount of internal change needed within the black community in education, skills, and attitudes seemed wholly unnoticed. Civil rights were important in and of themselves as a matter of justice, but to expect civil rights to solve our economic and social problems was barking up the wrong tree, close quote. Tom, this notion that civil rights, as important as they are in and of themselves as a matter of justice, but that the black community needed, and I'm quoting you again, internal change. Could you explain that?
Well, in one sense, that's, well, first of all, I would repeat that now, that all groups have their own cultures, and in many groups, including blacks, there are internal differences in cultures within the same race or ethnicity. And so one of the great handicaps historically that the black community has had is that during the era of slavery, blacks were concentrated 90% or more in the South. And the South, in turn, had its own culture, which was different from people who came from other parts of Britain. And I've gone into this at length in a book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And the people who came from the South, they had this culture when they were back in Britain, where they were called crackers and rednecks and things like that. And it's easy to understand if you understand the history of their life in Britain. But once they transferred to the United States, that same culture was a huge handicap. And that's the culture that blacks grew up in. And so, and again, with blacks as with the whites, more and more generations of blacks began to put aside that culture to operate in ways that would be more productive for them in the new society. And now this counterproductive culture persists in many low-income ghettos. And unfortunately, there are intellectuals and others who celebrate this culture and try to keep it going, when in fact it's a great handicap. Mm.
So I just want to correct a comment in chat. He actually doesn't believe in biological differences between races. He makes that quite clear, and he believes in cultural differences. I don't know this specific history. I haven't read that Black Rednecks and White Liberals book, but to collapse some cultural differences that you claim to have traced back to the UK hundreds and hundreds of years ago, claim that those persisted through slavery, and more than that are of first order importance compared to slavery, segregation, and modern discrimination, is really quite the historical leap. And again, while you could, being very charitable here, you could argue that there are different cultures in different communities, and maybe that's responsible for some outcomes, maybe. Again, he evades the first order importance question of what do we do to try and improve racial equality, and like what kind of policies could we pursue, and to what extent were those caused by the historic and ongoing sins of the American economic system. Because there's lots of practical proposals like reparations and things. Is it William Darity who did quite a detailed proposal on that? And it's just ridiculous, like to go that far back to the, because isn't it like Scottish Highlanders or something? They're saying they got the Scottish Highlander culture. Like, how can you claim that matters more than being literally enslaved for generations and generations and terrorized and segregated? Is absolutely absurd.
Tom, one of the themes that runs throughout your work, and again, it pops up again and again on your website, is this what you refer to as this lost century of black achievement. From the end of the Civil War to the enactment of the Great Society programs a century later, Black Americans made remarkable progress. I'm going to quote now from Discrimination and Disparities, one of your books, to which you link on your website. Quote, "The plain fact is that the Black poverty rate declined from 87% in 1940 to 47% in 1960, prior to the great expansion of the welfare state that began in the 1960s under the Johnson administration. And as late as 1969, 2/3 of all Black children were living with both parents," close quote. So this African Americans come out of slavery with no education, no what the economists call human capital. I'm putting this out to you to make sure I understand it correctly. Furthermore, they're handicapped by the ambient culture, white culture of the South, which places, relative to culture in the North, particularly, say, New England, it places little emphasis on education, for example. And by 1940, Blacks had not only begun to better themselves economically, they'd begun to achieve education, they had begun to move into certain trades. You remark elsewhere that African Americans are making progress, in particular in construction, for example. They have, by and large, intact families. And all of this century of progress, which predates the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, receives almost no notice in the academic literature. It's as if you take a century of really quite moving, a whole people making progress, and push it down the memory hole. Is that correct?
Yes. And this is part of a larger pattern in looking at statistics over time.
Yeah, the Blacks thing is really weird. It's something that's quite American. I never really heard that, and I heard racism growing up in the UK, believe me, but we never sort of say blacks, and I think Americans do say whites as well, but usually only after they've said blacks, maybe to try and correct it. But it is really weird that I don't. It's very, very dated. It's just it's just quite, I don't know. Objectifying.
It applies, for example, many people credit Ralph Nader with having made the country and the government conscious of various dangers, and so that they can have laws and agencies to control those dangers. And they'll point out that Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, put him on the map. When he...
Just in case you're not following, he's responding to a question about the civil rights movement by talking about traffic safety.
Argued that American cars were being made without regard to safety, and that the corporations were put more emphasis on styling, and that was costing people's lives and so on. And then after that, these government agencies came in, and then if you follow the data, the death rate in automobiles went down. And many people think that that's a convincing argument. But if you're looking at statistics over time, everything depends upon the date that you arbitrarily choose as the beginning. And so if you were to go back 30 years before Ralph Nader, you would find that automobile fatality rates were going down, and were going down at a far higher rate than it did after Ralph Nader. But it's only when you understand the importance of picking the right dates. In the case of blacks, I would pick the period from, say, 1940 to 1960. In 1940, 82% of black children were raised with two parents. After the 60s, and all the social things that happened, that fell to 17%. And so you destroyed one of the key institutions of any society, the family, and its influence. And that's the consequence. Similarly with things like violence. The homicide rate among black males fell during the 1940s by 18%. It fell again by 22% between 40 and 50. Now in the 1960s, which is when all progress is assumed to have begun, the Supreme Court began creating new constitutional rights for prisoners and criminals, and almost immediately, beginning in the 1960s, the homicide rate doubled, and it doubled. It doubled after 3 consecutive decades of falling homicide rates for the whole country. Now, you know, some things can be coincidences, but I don't think that qualifies as a coincidence. But so much of what is said, and you can go through things about the women's rights and so forth, where you find the very same pattern.
Right. So,
yeah, I use it's interesting discussion about what terms to use. I tend to use African American specifically when I'm trying to distinguish between black people in America versus black people in like other countries, because I do think that this whole discussion can be a bit US centric at times, so I think it's worth making that distinction. But I agree that also feels a bit dated. We're all just people, man. So anyway, he did talk about traffic safety. Now, to be fair to him, he was trying to weave it in with a narrative about like picking the correct dates for statistical comparisons. So he said before that there were modern traffic safety laws, actually accidents were declining, and then people credit the traffic safety laws with the decline that happened subsequently, even though they were already declining before. Now, the main problem that, I mean, obviously he's right that it's tricky to pick dates, but like, why pick his dates? He hasn't really made a convincing historical case for like why that's the correct reference point. Remember, 1940, yeah, his starting point, World War II, right? Like, you really shouldn't make inferences from periods like that. Now, this does speak to a bit of a complicated historical debate, and Sowell may have a bit of a point here, because I think Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, made a similar point. She said, actually, it's the segregated era, there was more economic stability for black people. Despite the segregation, there was more economic stability. So she did say that, and I guess it makes sense, right? I think what you're probably seeing, I mean, so many things are happening. Again, war, a big golden age, a big period of growth, 45 to 1960. That was like the golden age of capitalism that people call it. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that like black people were doing relatively well along with everyone else. But if economic opportunity started to dry up, that might also explain some of the problems. And, you know, the order that these things happened in matters too. Is it the case that it was the war on poverty, right? The expansion of the welfare state and civil rights, which Sowell wants to blame. Is it the case that they expanded and then all the problems appeared in black communities, or is it not? I just don't think this is a detailed enough comparison of a very complex historical period for him to just go like, oh, from 40 to 60, it was fine during the era of Jim Crow, and then it got worse with the civil rights movement. But it is, I'll tell you what though, and this relates to my third video on Sowell, which, by the way, will exist. There's this really interesting debate that I do think that we need to grapple with on the left, which is, I think in the minds of a lot of conservatives, things kind of went wrong in the 60s. And that's partly due to the civil rights movement and the expansion of the welfare state. And I think you saw ideas of equality, and also coupled with a more activist government, you saw all this come in. And this is like, I mean, these days it would be called the woke mind virus. That would bring it all together. But, it might have been called something else back then. But I think this is the picture that Sowell's painting. And it's quite interesting that they think that they would tend to say everything changed around then. Even the way the law was practiced in the US changed. It kind of moved away from the traditional US Constitution into a more hands-on, more French Revolution type thing, because conservatives, they'll either say things went wrong in the 60s in America, or they'll say things went wrong at the French Revolution, right? So there is something here, even though I think he's being, crude with his analysis.
Tom, again, let me quote, if I may, from Discrimination and Disparities. This is you writing in that book. There was a far more modest decline in the poverty rate among blacks after the Johnson administration's massive war on poverty programs began. And by 1995, only a third of black children were living with both parents. Among black families in poverty, 85% of the children had no father present, close quote. All right, this brings us to a very important question, which is...
Okay, so he's made the comparison.
Did the Great Society, we have...
But just to underscore this point, right, what he's doing is still like so crude by modern statistical standards. Like, this happened in this period, this happened in that period. Like, why don't you look at the expansion of welfare, right, and make comparisons with everything else held constant, like comparisons within the same period between different groups? How did it affect poverty, employment, etc.? They're not doing
government
that.
Programs, civil rights we have. You've already said those were essential simply as a matter of justice. At roughly the same time, we get welfare programs, a massive increase in government spending, the so-called war on poverty, and we also get cultural upheaval, a shifting or erosion of certain cultural norms. And your argument is civil rights the civil rights legislation, equality before the law, was just and necessary and overdue. We're happy that that happened. It needed to happen. But your argument is also that federal money, that the rise of the welfare state and the erosion of cultural norms took progress among black Americans, stopped it, and reversed it. In other words, that they actually did harm, or that they were merely irrelevant.
They did harm. And it did harm across the society, not just among racial minorities. You have people who've had meaning taken out of their lives. People, for example, I see in California especially, people who have young people with cars will go into some street area and then do all kinds of crazy driving with the car in order to attract a crowd, and that's what they get. But people...
Have you even listened to the fucking music these young people listen to today? Have you heard it, man? It's not even music, it's just sounds. God. And one of them was smoking marijuana.
Who have meaning in their lives from what they're doing. If you have having a family to support, having a child to raise, things like that, that puts meaning in their lives. But when all of that is taken out of their lives by the government, and especially when the government is paying people...
Enjoying this episode, absolutely. Just, mate, what if doing donuts in a car park gives me meaning? Have you ever considered that? Also, I'm sorry, look, I just replayed Bloodborne, and I can tell you in no uncertain terms that defeating the Orphan of Kos gave me more meaning than having children would.
When they have no husband present, and not paying them if there is a husband present, you're subsidizing a social change that is doing far more harm than whatever incidental good you're doing just by handing out some money.
All right.
It's just such shallow cultural analysis, isn't it? It's like, kids are doing things that I don't really like or understand, therefore this explains all of the problems of the world. Obviously you can make... Look, why doesn't he say something pertinent, like something about how we're overly digitized today and, you know, we're relating to each other through computers and, like, we don't have enough face-to-face stuff, there's no high street, Google Maps means that people don't ask each other for directions anymore, there's less human contact. Even that's fucking basic. That's some basic whinging about the digital age. That is the most basic point I've just made. Say something pertinent, dude.
Tom, education. We spoke a moment ago about the internal change that was needed in the black community. One of the central elements in that argument is education. And your website, again, factsagainstrhetoric.org, your website links to your 2020 book. This just amazes me, which you published on your 90th birthday. You know, one of these days you really ought to pull yourself together and accomplish something, Tom. This is your 2020 book, published on your 90th birthday, Charter Schools and Their Enemies. I'm quoting, New York City has a substantial sample of ethnically and socioeconomically comparable students whose educational outcomes can be compared, close quote. You identified 5 different charter school systems, each of which taught portions of its classes in ordinary public schools. In other words, the charter schools, it was a wonderful social test, so to speak, or experiment, because they drew from the same socioeconomic group and indeed conducted their instruction in the same buildings with public school students. And you produced 2 main findings in your book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies. Here's the first. You found that charter school students, especially Black and Hispanic students, outperformed the public school students. And the second
in that
major,
same building.
In the same building. You've got, in one example, only 7% of the kids in one public school passed a math proficiency exam. Among the charter school kids on the other side of the wall, being taught in the same building, the figure was 100%. So let's pause with that finding. How can that be?
Well, it certainly suggests that we ought to spend a lot more time comparing these cases where the students are in comparable places. In other words, they're not only in the same building, they're serving the same neighborhood, and most of them in both cases have come from low-income families, and they didn't put the smarter kids in one system. The charter schools admit deliberately by lottery, so there's no question that they're picking the smartest kids to start with. They're taking whoever wins the lottery, and in this case, the school you mentioned, by the way, is a school that I went to when I was a teenager in junior high school in Manhattan, 129th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and someone ought to be. One of my great frustrations is, despite whatever praise the book got, it really changed nothing. And I think there should be a high priority in letting low-income, Black, Hispanic, and other families know what difference the charter schools can make. Not all of them are good, but ironically, even the disappointing charter schools almost invariably still do better than the traditional public school housed in the same building with it.
So this brings us to your second major.
I'm not going to say much. Education and schools in particular isn't something that I know a lot about. I do think that the comparison that he did there was much better than the rest of his analysis. It was clearly well controlled, and if access is determined by lottery. I was thinking about funding. Are you talking about underfunded public schools relative to well-funded private schools? But yeah, fair enough, whatever.
Major finding in that book, Tom, the teachers' unions opposed the charter schools. So you go through the history of this battle in New York. I'm quoting you again. In New York City, this is as of 2020, in New York City, there are more than 50,000 children on waiting lists to get into charter schools, yet New York has ended the expansion of charter schools and threatened restrictions on those already functioning. And even national Black organizations oppose charter schools. In 2016, the NAACP called for a moratorium on new charter schools. What is going on there?
What is going on is that the charter schools collect billions of dollars in union dues, and they spend millions of dollars for financing the campaigns of politicians who will do whatever the charter schools want.
And whatever the unions want.
I'm sorry, yes, whatever the unions want. And it's painful.
Look, as somebody who streams himself live, has had live interviews, it's quite easy to make a mistake like that, and Sowell is quite old, but it is just quite a funny mistake for him to say charter schools accidentally, because it's like, hey, why do you think that, like, unions and civil rights organizations and various, woke intelligentsia. Why do you think that they may oppose privatizing schooling? Maybe it's because of something like this, some kind of corruption, some kind of bias in the teaching that's done in the interests of private organizations who are sponsoring it or something. Freudian slip, precisely. Was it a Freudian slip or was it the other one? What's the one that's like just a brain fart?
That even people who started out wanting to give parents the choice of where to go to school, when they learn about the political realities, they realize they're not going to get the charter school or get the teachers unions money if they don't try to stop the charter schools, and the kinds of things that are done to stop them. For example, in various cities around the country, where there's been population loss over the years, there are plenty of vacant schoolhouses because they're not needed. In those places, not only the whole educational establishment does everything they can to prevent those vacant buildings from being used by charter schools, because New York is not the only one that has large numbers of students on waiting lists to get into charter schools. So in some places, they have simply demolished these schools that have been vacant for years to make sure that the charter schools can't use them. And that's happened in Chicago, in various cities across the country. Try again, if there was some way of letting the people in these low-income neighborhoods understand that this is what's going on, I think we would have we'd have a chance of giving a lot of kids a better education.
So just to remind everyone, he did start this interview by saying that people don't engage in proper arguments and don't use evidence to back up their cases. What he's now done as an argument for charter schools and against public schools is say that the unions and black rights organizations and whoever else oppose them because they are basically corrupt, without really providing enough evidence in favor of that proposition. But what he's also not done is engaged in any arguments against charter schools. Like he just hasn't, like as if they don't exist. So not that we should be surprised, but he's the worst example of the thing he apparently hates.
Tom, since you published Charter Schools and Their Enemies in 2020, a few developments.
He sounds like some random old dude talking about a bunch of stuff he read on Facebook. Yeah, he does. Yeah. I don't know if he's a praxeologist, though, some guy. He's not an Austrian. I mean, the education system is fucked. Like, I can acknowledge that empty buildings are if there are schools needed, empty buildings are definitely a bad thing, but it's just...
I'd like to believe that at least some of this is a result of that book.
There's a lot of evidence that increasing public funding for public schools in America has beneficial effects. I talked about this in my Free Stuff is Good Actually video, right? There's a lot of evidence for that. And including some quite well randomized controls. I just wonder if his evidence may just be picking up a funding disparity, really.
Charter school enrollment nationwide has expanded up from 12% or almost 400,000 students since 2020, since the year before you published your book. Now, 400,000 students in charter schools is a relatively small number by comparison with the number of students across the country, but it's up 12%. Many of the biggest gains have come in the most rapidly growing states. Over the last 5 years, up 26% in Texas, 21% in Florida. Even in New York, even in your old home state, charter school enrollment is up 15%. And school choice legislation has spread across the country. It's state by state. In the last 3 years, the number of states with universal school choice legislation has risen from 0 to a dozen. That's since you wrote your book. In 2023 alone, 20 states expanded their school choice programs, and this very year, Texas is preparing to enact dramatic school choice reforms. Tom, have I encouraged you?
Yes, but there's another side to this as well.
All right.
The teachers' unions are well aware of all this, and they have put in all kinds of roadblocks to make it more difficult for kids to be sent to charter schools. For example, in California, the California law has said that charter schools are not allowed to suspend or expel students who disrupt the schools. Now, can you imagine any educational benefit that anyone could imagine will come from that? What is happening is one of the reasons that charter schools are good is that they insist on maintaining law and order in the schools. And so when you do all kinds of things, including beating up teachers, the kid doesn't get expelled. So now the charter schools were put in there as an experiment, so that as they had more freedom to choose what to do, and if some of those things worked out, then presumably some of those practices could be transferred to the traditional public school. What is actually happening is that when there's this gap between the two kinds of schools, you have laws and restrictions where you transfer the things that are failing in the public schools and force them on the charter schools. So instead of bringing the traditional schools up to the charter schools levels, the politicians are bringing the charter schools down to the levels of the traditional schools.
So remember that there is a trade-off to everything, according to Thomas Sowell. It's worth noting that, while there may be some of the benefits to having what he calls law and order in school, there are also costs, like you may end up discriminating against certain students. You may end up expelling students who don't deserve to be expelled. You may create an environment that isn't particularly conducive to learning. So it's not like that's just the answer and that's the best thing to do.
All right.
It seems like an obvious point to me.
I tried to encourage you. I tried, Tom. Affirmative action. This is another of the headings in the website. Again, it's factsagainstrhetoric.org. From your
is anybody counting the number of times they put this website on the page? So just to remind everybody, I think what's really interesting about facts against rhetoric. Can I spell? Maybe I should have gone to a charter school. Hey. Oh, and it's called TS Free Mind. Yeah, somebody mentioned that earlier. So what's interesting about facts against rhetoric is that this is itself a form of rhetoric to say that you have facts on your side. Purpose and urgency. Subjects, ability, affirmative action, Africa and Africans, Asian Indians, biographies, dictatorships, brackets C government, Jews. Mate, this website is amazing. I don't know, mate. You were all fucking tripping earlier when you said this wasn't a good website. War and peace, law, see government. All right, we're gonna come back to facts against rhetoric, or actually ThomasSowellFreeMind.com. We'll do that.
Memoir, A Personal Odyssey. I'm quoting you. One of the ironies that I experienced in my own career was that I received more automatic respect when I first began teaching in 1962 as an inexperienced young man with no PhD and few publications than I did later in the 1970s after accumulating a more substantial record. What happened in between was affirmative action hiring of minority faculty, close quote. Explain that. Affirmative action impinged on your own life, your own reputation?
Well, you know, I could give an example of something that puzzled me for a long time. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was trained as a photographer, and I was working in a photo lab. And
Hey guys, have you actually seen Thomas Sowell's photography? I mean, maybe he's trained as one, but oh boy.
And in barracks, there are a whole bunch of photographers. I was the only black photographer. And this is down in the South in the 1950s. And I noticed that when some of the other Marines in the barracks, the white Marines, from the South, when they had took a picture that went wrong and so forth, they'd come over there and they would come to me rather than to the white photographers. And it baffled me completely for about 20 years. And what happened at UCLA when I was teaching. I was teaching a course, and students said that they liked the course and all. And one young man came to me one day with a textbook, and there was a passage in it which he couldn't understand, and he asked me to explain it to him, and I explained it to him, and he said to me, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure. I wrote the textbook." But you see, what people use race as a way of getting at other things. These white Marines in that barracks down south in the 50s had no way of knowing who knew more about photography and whatnot. But they knew that if the Marine Corps had trained some black man to be a photographer, he was probably, you knew he knew his stuff.
Pretty damn good.
And conversely, after affirmative action, you see, now when I have far more experience and so forth, the students are questioning whether I know what I'm doing.
This is just a bit depressing at this point, but obviously, both are anecdotes, which are apparently the difference between these two anecdotes is supposed to say something about affirmative action, even though that hasn't been demonstrated. But one thing happened in the Marine Corps, right, when he was a photographer, and that was people asking him for help because he was clearly good at photography. The other thing is a student who said to him, "Are you sure about something he said?" Which isn't even that disrespectful. I just think it's a bit like maybe the student was confused. Thomas Sowell doesn't understand humans. I think this is what's happening here. That anecdote, the university one, is so weak. A student once asked me, "Are you sure?" Mate, I can come up with better anecdotes about being disrespected than that. I fucking definitely can. And I can tell you it's got nothing to do with affirmative action.
Got it. I see. One of the articles, back to the website, one of the articles to which you provide a link on the website is your 2012 review of a book called Mismatch.
Sympathy.
And the argument in that view is that affirmative action often places minority students in schools in which they would have trouble keeping up, even though they could have done well in other schools. I'm going to quote to you from your review of that 2012 book. Quote, "The authors of Mismatch have performed a major service. For those who think that black students on campus should be there to advance their own education and lives, not to serve in a role much like that of movie extras whose presence enhances the scene for others." Close quote. So affirmative action, you suggest in that review, is less to help black students, other minority students. It's less to help minority students make progress than to permit white liberals to feel good about themselves. Fair?
Yes, and not incidentally, ensure they can continue to get hundreds of millions of dollars each at universities like Columbia, which they couldn't get if they didn't have a certain percentage of minority students among their classes. And here again, there's an irony that these are places which have pushed affirmative action, and now they realize that if they don't have minority representation similar to that in the population, they can be accused of discrimination, and that can cost them money. And so these black students who are put in institutions where they're likely to fail, even though there are hundreds of other institutions where they would have succeeded, they're there more or less as human shields.
Tom, tell that story.
So I don't particularly like everything he said there, but there might be a nub of truth here about tokenism and PR, right? And like having, you know the way like every university brochure or pamphlet just has like, make sure that it's like multiracial, and we have like people in our department who've just been asked to appear in like every picture just because they're like not from the UK or they're not white, right? Like they just any picture that's taken of them gets put on the university website again and again and again, right? Like that does happen. Whether these black students are incapable of being there, I think is a separate question to the PR question, and I'm not entirely sure that he's demonstrated that. I don't think that's true. I think that, if anything, it's fucking posh white people who shouldn't be there.
You mention it again in your book, Personal Odyssey, but when you were at Cornell and you discovered that there were some black students at Cornell who struck you as extremely intelligent and capable, but they were struggling all the same. They were unhappy and even angry all the same, and you investigated. Do you remember that?
Yes. After Cornell suddenly started admitting black students with qualifications not as high as the students already there, I discovered that half the black students were on academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the test scores. Now, at that time, the average black student at Cornell scored at the 75th percentile on the SAT score.
Meaning that they were really smart kids.
They did better than 3/4 of the other of the students who took that test. But at Cornell, liberal arts college, which is where I taught, the average student there was at the 99th percentile. And so the professors teach to the kinds of students they have. Right. And therefore, they'll proceed at a faster pace. They'll proceed with fewer explanations because the students already know so much themselves. And so someone who is perfectly capable of handling the work, if it's taught in a way that's geared to students at the 75th percentile, cannot keep up. It was even more extreme at MIT. The average black student in one of the studies done some time back at MIT was at the 90th percentile in mathematics, which meant, they scored higher than 90% of the students who took the test. But they were so that made them in the top 10%. But at MIT, they were in the bottom 10%, because at MIT, there's no question that the vast majority of the students are in the 1%. So it's a question only of where you are in the top 1%, because virtually everybody else is.
Right.
And so they proceed obviously at a pace and complexity with those kinds of students, which most American students, black or white, wouldn't be able to keep up with.
Right.
So I might have missed it, but I don't think he proved that these black students are failing disproportionately. Clearly, one of the things that affirmative action is supposed to rectify are some of the biases that occur outside of these tests or before the tests or even within the tests, right? So I don't think that it's necessarily a terrible thing if there's a gap on entry. Furthermore, to the extent that minority students who were admitted because of affirmative action do fail at a disproportionate rate, it might also have something to do with how the university is set up and whether they are discriminated at by teachers, for instance, when they're at university. I don't, again, this is really complicated and it requires a lot of data that Sowell's not presenting. I don't know the answer, but I think you have to consider some of these questions before you jump to some kind of conclusion that, there are too many minority students because of affirmative action and they're not doing very well and they're not very happy. I mean, his evidence was that they're not very happy, and he said that was just from talking to some of them. That's not even test scores, right? That could be completely consistent with, look, right, I feel fucking intimidated when I go to places like this. I'm like lower middle class and white, obviously, right? Like those places are designed for a certain type of person. And so I can imagine being unhappy and even that affecting your academic performance when you're there. But that's a bias of the institutions. It's not a problem with affirmative action.
Tom, here's another item to which you link on your website. This is a critique of affirmative action by the late Justice Antonin Scalia. It's a longish quotation, but it's on your website, and I'd like to read it to you. Quote, this is the late Justice Scalia, quote, "I am entirely in favor of according the poor inner city child, who happens to be black, advantages and preferences not given to my own children, because my children don't need them. But I am not willing to prefer that the son of a prosperous and well-educated black doctor or lawyer, solely because of his race, should be given preferences over the son of a manual laborer. The affirmative action system now in place will produce the latter result because it is based on concepts of racial indebtedness rather than individual worth and need. That is to say, because it is racist."
Well, they started off okay, didn't he? But is the answer here not obviously to include class considerations in affirmative action or think about other policies that might help, rather than being against affirmative action? Like, yeah, it's an imperfect tool. But to what degree do we really think the cure is worse than the disease here? Like the son of a black lawyer, how much is that happening? The son of a black lawyer is preferred over the son of a white manual laborer. Like, is that really outstripping the corrective work that affirmative action is doing? Is the cure really worse than the disease? Again, this is just it's too general, quote. Right?
Now, it is one matter to say that affirmative action does a lot of harm, and you've just described instances in which it has done harm, taking very talented black kids and placing them in a situation in which they're going to feel inadequate for 4 years when they could have felt at the top of the charts in other institutions. But it's another matter to say that affirmative action, as we've experienced it across this 25 years or so, is racist. Are you willing to go that far?
Adjectives are not always the main thing. I'm
Oh my god. It's like a modern Eminem lyric. Adjectives are not always the main thing. However, they are the most.
Well, ready to deal with the factual evidence that minority students do better when they are put in institutions where the other students have qualifications similar to theirs.
Got it.
And the University of California system is a classic example. That towards the end of the 20th century, great numbers of black and
sorry, I'm still thinking about adjectives aren't always the main thing. Just like what? Which type of word is the main one? Is it nouns? I guess it's probably nouns. Now, if you had to like do like a tier, should we do like a tier? We could do a tier list of types of word. Because nouns are probably like, I don't know if they're S tier, they're maybe A tier. Interesting. That's something for us to think about a bit later.
Hispanic students were being brought
verbs
into
are
the
S tier.
system.
Verbs are
and
S
they were,
tier,
many
yeah,
of
of
them
course
were
verbs are
being
S tier.
sent to Berkeley or UCLA, the two top campuses in that large system. And they were doing very badly. And as they admitted more and more black students, the number who were graduating declined absolutely. And so that was clearly not working. The voters voted to end affirmative action admissions. It was predicted that there would be no more black students. It turns out that over the next few years, there were 1,000 more black students who graduated from that system, now that they were not being sent to UCLA and Berkeley, but to the other campuses where the other students had qualifications very similar to their own. Not only that, black students who are put into these places where they simply can't, it's a struggle just to keep from being flunked out. They switch from difficult subjects to tough subjects from difficult subjects like math, science, engineering, into things like sociology, education, and so on. So what happened is that you had virtually no change in the...
Just shout out to my sociology gang. Sociologists do use maths, for the record.
Total number of black students in the UC system after affirmative action admissions were outlawed, but you had a great increase in the number of black students who graduated. And really the point of going to college is not to be on campus, but to graduate so you can go out into the world and do something.
Right. Tom, I'm going to try to encourage you again. In the 2023 case of students for fair admissions versus the president and fellows of Harvard College, your old alma mater. I know you get all misty-eyed when I mention Harvard, Tom. 2023 case of students for fair admissions versus Harvard, the Supreme Court found that Harvard had discriminated against Asian students in admissions. That's the fact set. And the court ruled that universities could no longer consider race in their admissions policies. Looked at one way, looked at strictly speaking, that's the end of strictly race-based affirmative action, exactly the kind of affirmative action that Antonin Scalia found offensive. Have I encouraged you?
Unfortunately, that decision included something in there by the Chief Justice about how you could somehow read stuff that told you what the student's race was and consider that. I don't know whether how this decision that they made is going to work out in practice.
I see.
The same game was played with the Bakke decision years ago, and what it amounted to in that case was that you can't have racial quotas if you call them quotas, but you can have them if you call them something else. Now, I don't know whether this latest caveat, how that's going to work out in practice, but I found it very painful that a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would suggest some way in which you can evade the decision that's being made.
All right.
Of course, that's the way I read it.
All right.
I just want to underscore that there is plenty of evidence on the benefits of some of these policies. If you look at the economist Jennifer Doliak's review of Sowell's discrimination and disparities, she does discuss quite a lot of this evidence in detail. And yeah, of course, like any policy, there is some kind of cost. Sometimes it goes wrong. Maybe there are elements of the policy that could be changed, but there are beneficial effects. There are beneficial effects for the students and people affected directly by the policy. There are also quite a lot of proven benefits of like diversity in general, and they do just have a positive effect on the institution. They're good intellectually. and just abandoning these affirmative action policies, as imperfect as they are, is simply going to lead to a more racially and otherwise homogenous student body, as it was in the past, before the 60s apparently ruined everything.
Tom, a few last questions. We've been talking about your website, factsagainstrhetoric.org.
Come on.
I'd like to ask
Is it
you
going to come up?
a couple of questions about contemporary events. Let's start with Donald Trump and tariffs. Let me begin by quoting again from your book, Basic Economics. Quote, "The Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930, the highest tariffs in well over a century, were designed to reduce imports so that more American-made products would be sold, thereby providing more employment for American workers. It was a plausible belief, as so many things done by politicians seem plausible. But within 5 months, the unemployment rate rose to double digits, and it never fell below that level for any month during the entire remainder of that decade."
So obviously Sowell is right about these tariffs, I think, but like clearly there's a context here, which is the Great Depression. Actually, I'll let him speak.
The decade of the 1930s. That's Tom Sowell in Basic Economics. Today, President Trump has imposed a number of new tariffs, including an average of 39% on goods from China, 25% on goods from Canada, and 25% on goods from Mexico. And the president has announced a further 25% tariff on all imported cars and car parts effective April 3rd. As we record this, that April 3rd new tariff, 25% tariffs on cars, will kick in the day after tomorrow.
Ha-Joon Chang debunked what? The Smoot-Hawley tariffs being the cause of the Great Depression. Where did he do that? Because I'm quite familiar with his work, but I remember him talking more about historical industrialization and tariffs. I'm sure he has spoken about the Great Depression as well. Which book are you talking about?
What do you make of the present President of the United States and his tariffs?
It's painful to see what a ruinous decision from back in the 1920s being repeated. Now, insofar as he's using these tariffs to get very strategic things settled, and that he is satisfied with that. But if you set off a worldwide trade war, that has a devastating history. Everybody loses because everybody follows suit, and all that happens is that you get a great reduction in international trade. The other, it's disturbing in another sense. Franklin D. Roosevelt, when he was president in the 1930s, said that you have to try things, and if they don't work, then you admit it, you abandon that, and you go on to something else, and you try that until you come across something that does work. Now, that's not a bad approach if you are operating within a known system of rules. Mm. But if you are the one who's making the rules, then all the other people have no idea what you're going to do next. And that is the formula for having people hang on to their money until they figure out what you're going to do. And when a lot of people hang on to their money, you can get results such as you got during the Great Depression of the 1930s. So if this is just a set of short-run ploys for various limited objectives, limited in time, fine, maybe. But if this is going to be the policy for 4 long years, that you're going to try this, you're going to try that, you're going to try something else, a lot of people are going to wait. I think what happened in the stock market recently, when things came down substantially for quite a while, and I note that various people are holding on to their money before they do anything because they don't know where this is going to lead.
Right. Back to
Okay, so quite clearly he's completely right about Trump. He does seem to be attributing the Great Depression to Roosevelt's actions, or the how long it lasted for to Roosevelt's actions. And I think it's pretty widely agreed that the New Deal did create a kind of recovery, right? Like there was growth in GDP, there was a fall in unemployment. Now they did go back and forth on the New Deal, which probably created some uncertainty. But I think again the first order consideration here was that they were cutting it, right? So they started to cut it. The economy went back down again into a tailspin. I think in 1937. So for him to try and compare that to like that, they were clear. Also, he's saying like no one's going to know what you're doing. The New Deal has clear set of policies enacted over years, right? And then reversed a few years in and then reversed back. Yeah, a bit of uncertainty. But to compare that to Trump's, like, how long has he been in office? Like fucking, what, 3-4 months? Every day the policy changes. It's completely different, and all it does is just increase costs for people. There are like virtually no benefits. I just think it's weird that he has to start talking about FDR. Why can't he just say that Trump's... why can't he just say, like, just that Trump's wrong? I mean, to be fair, it was the interviewer's fault. He teed him up with a quote about the 1930s. So we'll blame the interviewer. The interviewer's a
question of race.
Twat anyway.
Our friend Jason Riley published a column in the Wall Street Journal headlined, quote, "Trump might have won the first post-racial election," close quote. Now I'm quoting Jason Riley. According to NBC News, since 2012, there has been a 15-point shift toward Republicans among black voters, a 32-point shift among Asians, and a 38-point shift among Latinos, close quote. Once again, I'm going to make an effort to cheer you up, Tom.
Is Jason Riley Tom Sowell's autobiographer? I think he is. I think that's Tom Sowell's Tom Sowell's autobiographer. Tom Sowell's biographer.
So, on my reading, one of the central questions, maybe the central question of American politics for the last 30 or even 40 years, has been whether identity politics would become the dominant mode of all of our politics, and people would vote according to their race. And to use George Will's phrase, we would not be conducting elections. Elections would simply represent censuses. All the white people vote one way, all the black people vote another way, and so forth. And Donald Trump, if I may say so, Donald Trump, of all people, is the one who has demonstrated that we can move beyond identity politics. That we can, that African-American males move toward the Republican side. Now, you can like the Republicans or you can dislike the Republicans, but the argument would be people are making up their minds for themselves as individuals, not simply voting on the basis of their race.
But why is that only true when they vote Republican? Why would you be only thinking for yourself when you vote Republican? There's just this whole unstated assumption that all the Democrat voters are like fucking dumb sheep being bought off by the woke intelligentsia. Just to make that clear.
Likewise Hispanics, likewise, and so forth. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, and it's one of the most encouraging developments, and one I was surprised to see come finally. One of the reasons, for example,
finally, people are voting for Donald Trump, who cozies up to white nationalists, and with J.D. Vance, who follows literal Nazis on Twitter as the vice president. Finally, we as a society are moving beyond race. It's so great to see all these non-white people deported to El Salvador just because, even ones who don't fit the criteria for who should apparently be deported. This is so encouraging, despite everything that I just said about tariffs and how catastrophic they could be.
Example why it's so hard to get a decent education for black kids and low-income black kids is that the black vote has gone automatically to the Democrats by a huge margins. for a very
Not automatically, because fuck it, because they're better, because they represented historically those interests better. It's just so unthinking.
long time. And it's the Democrats who get the money from the teachers' unions, for which they will then allow the teachers' union to do whatever they want, regardless of whether that is bad news for the black kids who can't get a decent education. So I think to that extent, it is encouraging. However, Jason Riley writes for the Wall Street Journal, which is an excellent publication, but unfortunately, low-income people are not likely to be reading the Wall Street Journal, and I don't know if there are enough people within the black community, leaders, who have sufficient interest in making clear what these alternative educational things are like. You mentioned earlier, I believe, that the civil rights organizations have lined up with the teachers' union. And I think, quite frankly, they're doing it for the same reason that the politicians do it. They get money from them. I can remember decades ago, a black Democrat that I knew said, the NAACP has become a wholly owned subsidiary of the labor unions. He didn't say that publicly, but he said to me privately.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's not uncommon. Something else that needs a lot more attention. Years ago, I did a book called Affirmative Action Around the World, in which I looked at countries in various parts of the world, Malaysia, Israel, England, wherever. And again and again, I see the same pattern of behavior. Wonderful beliefs and an utter failure to look empirically at what happens when you put the programs into action. I mentioned the thing about allowing some consideration of race. This whole thing was enacted in other countries years ago. In India, when the court started saying, no, we can't really have this kind of blatant favoritism and so forth, but you can take certain things into consideration. Immediately, people began giving interviews on it would be subjectively evaluated. And of course, for the kids who are scoring low, they give them high ratings on these things that are subjectively evaluated. And the ones who are high, they give them low ratings. And so they're back to affirmative action in the bad sense, despite what's being said.
Tom, the United States of America.
Yeah.
Your life has now spanned more than 1/3 of the entire existence of this country. Now, the country remains far from perfect. On the other hand, you were born into the Jim Crow South. There you are, I know this from reading your book, A Personal Odyssey, there you are as a student at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And then you later returned to Washington as a civil servant. And there were drinking fountains you couldn't use. And there were restaurants and cafes in Washington where only the whites were permitted to sit down and black people had to stand at the counter. That's gone. You've led a remarkable life yourself in which, in all kinds of ways, the central theme of your work has been this country. What's wrong with the country, the competing visions, the vision of the anointed, the way the intellectuals misbehave, the way we need to understand race and ethnicity in this country in the larger context of race and ethnicity around the world. So you're not just a remarkable figure, you're a distinctly American figure, in my view. And students today are taught in all kinds of ways, and sometimes explicitly, that the United States is permanently flawed. They're taught to look down on the country. Ta-Nehisi Coates, here's a quotation. "The American dream cannot exist without racial injustice," close quote. Tom, what should students understand about the United States?
First of all, they should understand something about the actual history of the United States instead of the propaganda. That's not likely to happen. And this is a problem that extends beyond blacks or and other low-income minorities. This longer than year-long curse of anti-Semitism all over the country, and not just anti-Semitism in words, but actually forcing the violence and so forth, and that is something that's going to be very tough to get rid of. Mm-hmm. But I think it can be gotten rid of, and I think this taking away the money from Columbia is a perfect first step.
So, I don't quite. In case you missed his weird little pivot there, suddenly he was talking about anti-Semitism, which presumably refers to the protests in the wake of the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's not entirely clear why that's anti-American, though. He was trying to prove the point that students are indoctrinated to be anti-American. I mean, kids still say the Pledge of Allegiance, man. Like, I don't see it personally. You just talked about Trump getting elected. Make America great again? I don't know. Maybe all of these disparate paranoid boomer threads that you're drawing together are not actually particularly linked, and they're just things that you don't like. Maybe, maybe. But, still, go America.
And Columbia is not the only one that's like this. They're the ones who got caught red-handed. And I think that we need to stop thinking about these institutions as places that are so wonderful and have great...
Tom, you may disagree with them, but that doesn't mean that you get to use the coercive power of the state against them. Why don't you engage these protesters in reason and argument? Logic and facts. Facts and logic.
Great people. Right now, the latest issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education is expressing outrage that the government dares to expect these institutions to live up to the laws. I think it is long overdue for them to live up to the laws.
Thank you. Tom, would you close our conversation today? I'd like to, not only do I admire your reading, but I love your voice. And if this academic stuff ever blows over, you've got a great future in podcasting. But would you read for us what I take as almost the most important passage?
Tom, how do you manage to be so handsome, so charming, so intelligent and well-spoken? Why is it that when I look into your eyes, I am reminded of my boyhood? I feel like a little boy in the sheer glowing aura that your presence bestows upon those around you.
In all of basic economics.
Yes. And it's the last paragraph in the book. However useful economics may be for understanding many issues, it is not as emotionally satisfying as more personal and melodramatic depictions of these issues often found in the media and in politics. Dry empirical questions are seldom as exciting as political causes. The ringing moral pronouncements. But the empirical questions are questions about what that must be asked. if we are truly interested in the well-being of others, rather than in excitement or a sense of moral superiority for ourselves. Perhaps the most important distinction is between what sounds good and what works.
To pick an example out of thin air, perhaps something like free markets sounds good. Does it work? You can't debate Tom Sowell. Oh, yeah. You can't debate Tom Sowell. Mate, he can't debate himself. He just read his own quote wrong at several points.
Thomas Sowell, author of thousands of newspaper columns and magazine columns, author of dozens of books, and now the author of a website, Facts Against Rhetoric, factsagainstrhetoric.org.
I can't
Tom,
wait to visit this
thank
website
you.
and learn about
Thank
Jews.
you.
For uncommon knowledge.
It's so great. It's very interesting that he literally just highlighted anti-Semitism as apparently one of the main problems among students, the left, whatever, the kids. This is his website, Jews. Let's click. Yeah, okay. Electronic media. Oh, this is just a bunch of references. Oh, I thought it was going to be a summary of his views. How anti-racism becomes anti-Semitism. Wall Street Journal 2023. It is really interesting how the entire discourse reverses around anti-Semitism. Because whereas before it was the woke intelligentsia looking to find racism in absolutely everything, it now suddenly becomes the conservatives, and they do it like to a much worse extent. This is a recently made website. Bro, this is cutting edge stuff. This is cutting edge stuff. Look. Website from the 1930s. Oh, man. Ability. Wait, loads of this is just him. It's just like, there's like, you do question whether this man has ever like had fun. Africa and Afrikaans. Hey, he's got the scramble for Africa in there. Fair enough. I mean, look. Credit where it's due. I'm sure there's some interesting references in here, but nobody's going to visit this site, man. It's just like all of his books are just like just the title. The fade between pages. Oh, yeah. It looks like it's bugging out, doesn't it? Yeah. Oh, look at that. Italians. All right, is everybody ready for some anti-Italian racism? Jeez, honestly, Free Luigi. So that was something. I thought more of it would be about. Trump's tariffs, but that was obviously I got kind of clickbaited, and it wasn't. It wasn't. Most of it was just stuff that we've seen him say before, and a lot of stuff about race, and clearly he's past his prime. And my God, that interviewer, I just can't believe like how much of a sycophant he is. I've never seen anything like it. All right, let's cut off the stream. Let's cut it off while we're winning. I might just clip this and put it on my second channel or whatever. Do I think he's a grifter or was a grifter, or does he believe in what he's saying? An interesting case study comes from Applied Economics, his book Applied Economics, which in the first edition did not have a chapter on immigration, It's like the more advanced follow-up to Basic Economics. It did not have a chapter on immigration between, I think, 2003 and 2008. I might be getting the dates wrong. There was a second edition released with a whole new chapter on immigration. That immigration chapter is the worst thing I've ever seen written by Sowell, because the economics of immigration is pretty clear. Immigrants are good for the economy. They're good for like growth, the size of the economy. They're good for government revenues. They tend to contribute more than they take. They don't really displace natives. They're just generally very good for an economy and a country. The evidence on that is unequivocal, and he just spends the whole time complaining about like random anecdotes, kind of like you've seen him do here, just like about what immigrants or the children of immigrants may or may not do. So to answer your question, I think that he obviously always had conservative proclivities, and you can see it in his older books, but I think he realized he could make a living when he started complaining about the intelligentsia and social justice and stuff like that, which happens, I think, in 1984 when he published Intellectuals and Society. It was very critical of intellectuals and social justice. That's where it's got like the really homophobic stuff in it that we read at the start of the stream, if anyone was here. So I do think that what you see is just over time him gradually realizing the issues he needs to address and the opinions he needs to have on them in order to become more famous, make more money. After all, he is a rational agent. That's the lens he applies to everyone else. Ezra Klein. Man. I just want to... Do you guys ever get it? You know, sometimes when there's just an issue in the news that, or something that everybody's talking about, and you're just like, I'm just going to swerve this. I'm just not gonna, you know what? I'm just not gonna read it. I'm not gonna read anything about it, and I'm not gonna talk about it. For me, that abundance book is the thing at the moment. I'm like, you know what? It's a bridge too far. But shall I tell you what is exciting? In approximately a week or something, I'll probably release my video on Freakonomics, on the death of Freakonomics. So that's not about Thomas Sowell. Why don't you all enjoy that? Freakonomics, more interesting than Ezra Klein. There's your tagline. That'll probably be the title of the video. Freak abundance. Yeah, Freakonomics, man. Don't worry, the video's 2.5 hours long, obviously. Well, it goes into super Freakonomics as well. Man, there's so much shit in that book. It's so bad. You guys don't understand. The chapter on black names in particular. Oh, thank you, whoever said my book is awesome. I actually can't read your name against the background of my display. But it'll be in about a week. I'm going to go, though. I have football. We all enjoyed that. I'll probably just upload it to my second channel because it's like, whatever. It's just the content reel, isn't it? It's just slop. It's just fucking pure slop. And that's what you all want and desire. And that is what I will give to you. The unwashed masses of my chat. No, thanks for joining. Anyway, I hope that was more boring. The interview was more boring than I thought, but you know, you guys kept me sane during it, so